So we'll begin with Dr. Plamen Ivanov and his talk. So Dr. Ivanov is the lecturer in economics and banking at the University of Winchester in the business school there. He received his PhD from the University of Southampton in 2019. And his research focuses on credit institutions and their role in economic development. He's going to be speaking us today on the economics of food security for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion period of about 20 minutes or so before moving on to our second talk. So over to you, Plamen.
Okay, so as Alicia said, my name is Dr. Plamen Ivanov, and I'm a lecturer in economics and banking at the University of Winchester. And today I'll be talking about a paper that I'm preparing for Richard's special issue in the Journal of Frontiers in Sustainable Food Systems. And what I thought is quite appropriate is to talk about how we as Christians and as individuals, we can coordinate in the spirit of Jesus Christ and what he preached, and how this was implemented in Germany in order to produce sustainable food systems with affordable food. So in relation to this, let me just outline what is happening in the world of food systems nowadays. So historically, when we look at humankind, we can see that famines have toppled countless political regimes through the history of mankind, ranging from the famines in the Babylonian time through famines in Mesopotamia, in Turkey, and all over the world. Whenever there is famine, people go and revolt against the establishment, against the political establishment. And we can see that even nowadays with the contemporary events unfolding in Sri Lanka, formerly Ceylon, Egypt, and so on. And from a political perspective, from the perspective of political organizers, well, you don't want to put your finger in creating, a situation for revolution, because usually politicians enjoy a nice and easy life, as you can see with Boris Johnson. He's creating the rules for all of us, but then he breaks them. And obviously you don't want to do that with the food system, because this will lead to revolt and you'd be ousted out of your comfort seat in the political establishment. And this is unspokenly recognized by the United Nations and its Sustainable Development Goals. It's one of, I think it's Sustainable Development Goal number 2, is that it needs to resolve world hunger by the year 2030. But this high social goal seems unachievable in the contemporary unstable socio-economic and political life. And thanks to the pandemic, we saw that there is a spike in the world hunger, and our contemporaries nowadays attribute this increasing food insecurity to several major pillars. One is the COVID-19 and the supply chain issues, from small agricultural producers up the chain to us in the Western world, or even locally amongst those small agricultural producers in South America, Africa, South Asia, and so on. Some other observers, such as my PhD advisor and second speaker today, Professor Werner, they attribute the increasing food insecurity and food inaffordability to loose monetary and fiscal policy in response to COVID-19. Essentially, for him and other scholars like him, like myself, this expansion of quantitative easing in the shadow of COVID-19, the government response of borrowing way too much money, which were underwritten by the central bank in the UK, that's the Bank of England, has led to expansion of the monetary base. And as we know, very simple economics, when there is more money chasing the same amount of goods or even less, what we will observe soon after that is increasing the food prices. And Another more recent explanation by economists and political observers is the ongoing fraternal conflict between the two baskets of the world. As we know, Russia and Ukraine, they're two of the large producers of wheat and basic foodstuffs for the planet. For me personally, all of these three have undoubtedly impact on the food price index. But in my view, actually, the fragile food system that we have nowadays actually has been created as a byproduct of the financialization of the food systems with the emergence of Friedman's shareholder primacy argument. And essentially, as part of the financialization and neoliberalization of agricultural production, we have seen some structural adjustments in agricultural systems. Under the aegis of the World Bank and the IMF, in order to resolve the declining agricultural product under the free market, essentially theology, they have pushed for three concurrent developments in terms of agriculture and agricultural production. One was the liberalization of interest rates prior to the 1970s. Actually, agricultural producers could borrow at fixed rate or subsidized rates in order to have sufficient amount of money in order to invest in their seeds, in their machinery, in any other capital stock that they want to invest in order to produce the foods that all of us consume at reasonable rates. However, with the shift of towards free market economics, this central planning tool was sent to oblivion, and essentially there was a shift towards a market rate. And what this meant for farmers around the world was that they had no security about the rate at which they can borrow. And particularly this is worrisome because if you see massive shifts in the interest rates, then this would have major impact on how you'd price your commodities. Concurrently to this, there was a large-scale privatization of agricultural banks, but not only banks, all kinds of public institutions who were acting for the common good. And for some scholars, such as Martin and Clapp, this is illogical because these state-owned banks were first established in order to alleviate the credit rationing that farmers were faced with in earlier periods, because essentially banks, they don't understand enough agricultural business, and for many banks this is a high risk business, but this is not necessarily true perception of the banking industry of agricultural production. And equally, what the World Bank and the IMF pushed for is financial inclusion of finance by farmers via microfinance institutions, with the aim to replace usury loans, essentially meaning high interest rate, or loan sharks who are charging those high rate loans. However, all of these developments have not led to financial access by farmers around the world. In the context of India, Bharti observes that policy interventions imposed by the IMF and the World Bank were performed for promoting access to agricultural finance. However, access to finance by farmers always remained one of the biggest challenges for the local production. And Kyon observes the same issue as well. Many financial institutions remain extremely reluctant to engage in agricultural finance, despite the fact that there was a liberalization of the market, so that it's easier for banks of all ilks to provide agricultural finance. Actually, they don't want to do that. And the standard explanation to this is informational asymmetry, because banks, they don't understand the business of the borrowers, because as you are all aware, each farm has its own characteristics. The soil in each farm is different, the output in each farm is different, and this would require a lot of information gathering from the banks, And on top of that, they would bear risks such as commodity price risk. They wouldn't be certain at what price the commodity would be sold at the year end, or a few years down the line if they invest in some longer term seeds and plants, and so on. And the other very worrisome element for banks in providing agricultural finance is the irregular cash flows for these producers. And as a result of these informational imperfections between borrowers and lenders, credit markets often do not seem to satisfy all credit demands, including that of farmers. And this is barely surprising to any rational researcher, as Keynes has observed that back in the 1930s in his monetary economics explorations. In there, he said that there is normally a fringe of unsatisfied borrowers who are considered to have the first claims on banks' favors. However, there are ways around resolving these informational asymmetries. Empirical research has shown that actually physical relationship between the borrower and the lender, knowing the borrower better, their characteristics as individual, as business, their honesty, their due diligence, can reduce these informational asymmetries and actually make the lender much more confident in lending to that individual than purely transaction-based banking, as it's currently done by the vast majority of banks, simply looking at these cash flows that I was talking about and what's the past behavior of this individual, because they don't take into account, the nature of that person, his family situation, even his devoutness to the church, and so on. But all of these soft facts can actually improve the relationship between the borrower and the lender and improve the probability for credit provision. Actually, my supervisor with one of my other fellows, PhD students, they published an article in 2021 showing that essentially small banks lend to small borrowers in the United States, medium-sized banks lend to medium-sized borrowers, and big banks lend to big banks. And actually, this goes right into the reason why these structural reformations in the post-liberalization period have not succeeded, because essentially these microfinance institutions that have been established by the World Bank, IMF, and other international organizations are mostly urban or semi-urban, and they are not around the agricultural farmers in rural areas in Africa, in South Asia, in South America. And the reasons for that are that it would be very costly to go and service all of these farmers around the given area there. And this leaves a rural credit gap where the rural population are essentially financially excluded from the financial system, even though there are attempts to include them. And at the same time, their tickets for business by banks are too small to be considered, because banks would need to cover the costs for monitoring and issuing the loan. And if you want to borrow 10,000, 15,000 pounds from the bank, and they need to monitor how you spend the money, how you sell your goods, and in case you default, they would need to sell on the goods that you have produced. This would be very costly for them, so they tend to shy away from that market, and this leaves a massive rural credit gap all around the world. However, this is not true to a certain extent, because actually Germany has resolved that issue. And why do I study Germany? Well, because it's one of the most successful agricultural exporters in the world. Another example is the United States, but the United States has much more land upon which agricultural output can be grown, quite important in agricultural spaces. But despite the relatively small lands that Germany has, the relatively small proportion of population involved in agricultural production and technology and manufacturing, it is still one of the top 3 largest exporters of agricultural goods and services around the world, and #1 exporter of confectionery, cheese, pork, and agricultural technology. And actually, if you go to any UK supermarket, including Lidl and Aldi, to German supermarkets, you would find that a great proportion of particularly the higher value added goods, the processed products, are produced in Germany. And if you go in other countries, such as my home country in Bulgaria, you actually find that not only the higher value added goods are produced in Germany, but many of the basic foodstuffs are also produced in Germany. Because we don't have these protectionist policies as in the UK, so that vegetables are produced locally and so on. So Germany is a very good example to see how this highly developed nation has managed to provide food security for its populace, but also to start exporting. And essentially, by reading a lot of background literature, I found out that this success of the agricultural sector in Germany is largely thanks to the cooperative movement that has gained momentum in the mid-19th century due to two main reasons. One was a famine of 1846, and essentially people were bringing themselves together in order to resolve the famine. And by famine, we literally mean people dying out of starvation. And essentially, the Germanic societies at the time were structured in such a way that they were all living in small localized villages, and they saw these cooperatives as a self-help tool due to the incapability of the politicians to promote the well-being of the poorer communities amongst themselves, which is very similar to the failure of today's political leaders with the SDGs. And what the locals, what the Germans saw and perceived as a self-help tool was based on 3 pillars. Essentially, there was a lack of transparent credit terms and conditions available to small-scale entrepreneurs and farmers by back then contemporary commercial banks and public banks. And also, at the same time, what I meant by the political failures of politicians at the time was that they enacted law by which each township in Germany is allowed to establish a public savings banks in order to alleviate famine. However, these public savings banks were not advancing any money to people who are needing that money to buy literally the bread so that they can live on. Instead, the wealthy individuals which were sitting on the board of these public savings banks were lending their own money at the humanitarian interest rate of 30% per annum, which we as Christians as we know, is the second mortal sin when we charge, usurious interest rates as well. And essentially, these two developments, the lack of transparent credit terms and reasonable interest rates at which people and farmers can borrow money in order to survive, uncovered a gap in the credit market, and this led to the opening of the first credit cooperatives in order to alleviate these deficits of the operations of public savings banks. And these cooperative banks that have started springing up quite often quite quickly after that are based on 4 principles. They're locally rooted financial institutions with high degree of local autonomy. They are inclusive institutions providing services to those who may be excluded from the high street banks. And this means that they were offering financial services to the local farmers, both thriftness, savings, so that whenever they're faced with a famine, they have a little bit of saving to survive on, but at the same time, credit facilities so that the farmer can borrow short, medium, or long term, depending on what they need to do. And on top of that, in alignment with their Christian principles, mostly these credit cooperatives, they were profit centered, but just in order to cover the costs of the operation, and they were prioritizing the welfare of businesses and individuals. So these are triple bottom line institutions if we use contemporary linguistics. And I have hand collected the addresses of all 1,500 and something banks, cooperative banks in Germany a few months ago. And I created the following map, which depicts the headquarters of each cooperative bank around Germany. So this shows us how close each cooperative bank is to its borrowers. And these cooperative banks, say in Dortmund, they're not going to lend to someone in Rostock, but they're going to lend to individuals that are known to the credit officers in the local community, and the local money will be circulating there. So this is a map of 1,500 cooperative banks that have been established in Germany. These are the current operating banks. Actually, the European Central Bank has done a stellar job at slashing the number of cooperative banks in Germany at about half. There used to be 3,000 cooperative banks in Germany prior to the establishment of the European Central Bank, but the low interest rates and unfavorable legislation has led to halving the number of cooperative banks in Germany, which is quite unfortunate because actually these are the institutions, as we can see from contemporary data, that's data from 1968 to 2021. Here the bright yellow is the proportional lending of cooperative banks in Germany over that time periods to agricultural lending. So as we can see, even in the current world, the vast majority of agricultural lending comes from cooperative banks or other public interested institutions, such as the public savings banks, the Landesbanken, which are the central banks for the savings banks, and so on. And actually, the private commercial banking sector in Germany delivers only a small proportion of all of the lending to agricultural production. And not only this, but the vast majority of agricultural lending by term of length is long-term. And this provides security for the farmers in Germany in order to produce their output and increase the food security for their own populace and also export purposes. And these institutions have not come around out of the blue. They have been a brainchild of three visionaries, in my view: Friedrich Wilhelm Raiffeisen, Hermann Schulze-Delitzsch, and Wilhelm Haas. And in the rest of the talk, we'll quickly cover Friedrich Wilhelm Raiffeisen, as he based the Raiffeisen concept on the Christian principle of love thy brother. For him, that was key because he saw the state as a nanny, and he didn't want people to get used to the nanny state, because then they would be dictated how to live their life. And actually, I've seen that now with the COVID crisis. Essentially all of us have been instructed by the nanny state what we need to do, which goes against the grains of principles of self-determination and economic freedom that Raiffeisen was following. Just a quick biographical account of Raiffeisen. He was, as the previous slide said, he was rejected for military service and he engaged in a political career. And as part, at the beginning of his political career, the famine of 1846 struck, and he organized a bread cooperative and leased a bakery where he was selling to poorer families at 50% lower than the market price, including on credit. And he acted against the explicit orders of his superior because he was worried that these individuals would be irresponsible and they would forego the credit. Essentially, they would create a credit default. But no, people were grateful to what Raiffeisen organized, and they paid off all of their debt in full, every single of them. And there's no bank in the world that can boast such a credit rating nowadays. And the cooperative had no shareholders, and it was informal, dissolved once Raiffeisen was promoted as a mayor of nearby villages. However, this idea of cooperatives stayed with him for the rest of his life, and he started building this idea of credit cooperatives as banks. And initially, he set up a benefit society for the support of poor farmers with the support of 60 welfare families who underwrote all of the loans that were conferred to those poorer members of the family. Again, the concept of sharing your wealth with your brother from the Bible. And what Raiffeisen made sure was that these loans were advanced for the purchase of long-term capital, such as homesteads, tools, seeds, and livestock, rather hand-to-mouth finance, so that these farmers and poorer families can set themselves up and their future generations as well. And given that credit lending is quite risky business, initially he took on a lot of the credit due diligence, just making sure that there would be no credit defaults. So he was auditing every single penny or every single shilling that was spent by the borrowers. And then once he saw that he can trust the people that he's lending the money to, he outsourced that, and he was focused simply on credit monitoring. Then he carried on these principles as mayor of Hedesdorf, and there he reaffirmed his hatred for public savings banks, and there he made the following comment that the paternalistic state system does not allow such a thing. All the people must be helped, and indeed through the path of legislation. He disliked that idea because for him, people can help themselves and between themselves rather than relying on the paternalistic state. So as part of his different roles as political leader and involved in different types of credit cooperatives in different parts of Germany, he came to the principles of Raiffeisen, where he established the Raiffeisen brand as we know it nowadays. There is a joint liability of all members, as with any cooperative. The credit granting would happen only to members. But there will be no entry fee, no deposit requirements, and no profit sharing of any profits. This was aimed with financial inclusion so that everybody could become a member of the credit cooperative, and loans were issued to reliable citizens of whom you have essentially the sufficient soft information, but also hard information that they run a sound business back then on Christian principles and so on. And having looked at the success of the few credit cooperatives that he set up in previous years when he was mayor of different towns, he commercialized his concept, and he remained true to his ethics and principles, and he stated that I could not part from the idea that such association should not be based on self-interest, but rather must be founded on the ideas of Christian duty and empathy. And the success of his Raiffeisen idea was based on very simplistic principles. There was no need for all of these documents to be submitted to loan officers as our contemporary system does. The board of directors and the people making the decisions in these very Christian institutions were the mayor and the local teacher. And essentially the mayor and the local teacher know the whole community, and you don't need a sophisticated credit scoring model to tell you whether you can lend to Jane Doe or someone else. You know that person because remember, back then people were living in small communities of 200, 300, 500 people, and everybody knew everybody. And most importantly, the bankers and the bank were unified under the common public interest to avoid famine. And all of the credit that they were advancing was with the purpose to increase the food security of the local community. And the Raiffeisen motto was very simple: money of the village to the village, rather than the standard practice of nowadays, where usually money are withdrawn from villages and used by financial institutions to speculate with commodities, shares, and so on in the institutional centers around the world. And just to conclude, because I think I'm running over the time, cooperative banks can act as the institutional example to alleviate food insecurity. They provide long-term low-interest rate credit to agricultural producers. They can act as decentralized institutions to fund investments and capital creation in the local communities, as did the Raiffeisen banks. They can be more than profit institutions. They can still chase profit in order to cover the costs for their operations, but they can prioritize the well-being of the populace. And they were most importantly founded as a counter-cyclical tool to alleviate famine by Christian communities for Christian communities. So thank you very much, and sorry for taking longer than I should have.